In April 1942, 16 American bombers took off from the deck of an aircraft carrier in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, aircraft that had never before been launched from a ship of this kind, on a mission that every single man aboard understood, from the moment they volunteered, offered essentially no realistic chance of a safe return. Their target was Tokyo. Their fuel, even under ideal conditions, was not sufficient to fly there, complete their mission, and make it back to any friendly airfield. Most of the crews knew, before they ever left American soil, that this would very likely be a one-way flight. They volunteered anyway. Just 4 months after the devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor had crippled American naval power in the Pacific and left the nation reeling from its first direct experience of major wartime attack on its own forces, a small group of American aviators carried out a mission so audacious, so mathematically unlikely to succeed by any conventional military calculation, that senior Japanese military leadership had genuinely believed an attack of this nature to be essentially impossible. This is the true story of the Doolittle Raid, the mission that could not have worked, and somehow did. To understand why this mission was conceived at all, it helps to understand the genuinely desperate strategic and psychological situation facing the United States in the early months of 1942. The scale of the crisis facing American military planners during this period is difficult to fully appreciate from a modern perspective, accustomed as we are to knowing how the broader war eventually concluded. In the weeks and months immediately following Pearl Harbor, American military and civilian leadership faced a genuinely uncertain, deeply alarming strategic picture, with Japanese forces advancing rapidly and seemingly almost unstoppably across an enormous swath of the Pacific and Southeast Asia. American forces in the Philippines, despite a determined and ultimately costly defense, were forced into a prolonged, increasingly hopeless retreat that would culminate in one of the most significant American military surrenders in the nation's history. British forces suffered a similarly catastrophic defeat at Singapore, previously considered one of the most formidable Allied strongholds in the entire region. Australia itself faced genuine, credible concern about the possibility of Japanese invasion, a fear that, while ultimately not realized, reflected the genuine severity of the strategic situation facing Allied forces throughout the Pacific during this early period of the war. Senior American military and political leadership, including President Franklin Roosevelt himself, recognized a genuine and pressing need to provide the American public with some tangible demonstration that offensive action against Japan, however limited in immediate material impact, remained possible, both to sustain domestic morale and to signal to Japan and to America's allies that the setbacks of the war's opening months did not represent an irreversible strategic trajectory. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 had inflicted catastrophic damage on the American Pacific Fleet, destroying or severely damaging numerous battleships and killing over 2,000 American service members in a single devastating surprise attack that caught American forces almost entirely unprepared. In the months that followed, Japanese military forces achieved a rapid, seemingly unstoppable series of additional victories across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, capturing the Philippines, Singapore, and vast stretches of territory, with a speed and effectiveness that left American and Allied military planners scrambling to develop any kind of effective, immediate response. Beyond the purely military dimensions of this crisis, American political and military leadership recognized a genuinely serious psychological and morale problem developing, both among the American public and, just as significantly, within Japan itself. Japanese military and civilian leadership had consistently assured their own population that the Japanese home islands remained entirely safe from any possible American attack, geographically isolated and protected by the vast distances of the Pacific Ocean and the overwhelming naval and air superiority Japan had rapidly established across the region following Pearl Harbor. This assurance had become an important pillar of Japanese public confidence and morale during the war's opening months, and American military planners recognized that directly challenging this assumption, even through a relatively small-scale attack, could provide a psychological benefit to both American and Japanese public perception of the war's likely trajectory that would far exceed whatever limited physical damage such an attack might realistically inflict. The fundamental challenge facing American military planners was a straightforward, seemingly insurmountable geographic and technical problem. Conventional American bombers, capable of carrying a meaningful bomb load to targets within Japan itself, required far more runway distance for takeoff than could realistically be provided by any available aircraft carrier, the only American military platform capable of approaching Japanese territory closely enough to bring land-based bombers within their effective operational range. Aircraft carriers of the era were designed and equipped to launch considerably smaller, shorter-range naval aircraft, not the larger, heavier bombers that would be required to inflict any meaningful damage on Japanese territory, and, crucially, to carry sufficient fuel for the kind of extended mission this attack would necessarily require. The specific solution to this seemingly impossible technical challenge emerged through the persistent efforts of a naval officer who recognized a potential, if extraordinarily risky, path forward. Captain Francis Lowe, serving on the staff of Admiral Ernest King, the senior American naval commander overseeing Pacific operations, observed during a visit to a naval air station that twin-engine Army Air Forces bombers were conducting practice takeoffs using a runway marked to simulate the dimensions of an aircraft carrier's flight deck. This observation sparked the recognition that certain twin-engine Army bombers, specifically the B-25 Mitchell, possessed flight characteristics that might, under the right circumstances and with specialized modifications, actually be capable of taking off from an aircraft carrier's flight deck, despite never having been designed or previously used for this purpose. This insight led to an unprecedented, closely held collaboration between the United States Navy and Army Air Forces, service branches that, at this early stage of the war, had relatively limited history of close operational coordination on missions of this nature. The plan that emerged called for a squadron of modified B-25 bombers to be loaded onto the deck of an aircraft carrier, transported within striking distance of the Japanese home islands, and launched directly from the carrier's flight deck to conduct a bombing raid against targets within Japan itself, an approach that had genuinely never been attempted before and that carried enormous technical and operational uncertainty at essentially every stage of its execution. Command of this extraordinarily risky mission was given to Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, an aviator whose reputation as one of the most accomplished and technically skilled pilots in the entire United States Army Air Forces made him a natural choice to lead an operation that would require both aircraft and air crews well beyond their conventional operational parameters. Doolittle, who held a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and had established himself before the war as one of America's most celebrated air racing and precision flying pioneers, brought both the technical expertise and the personal credibility necessary to convince skeptical senior commanders that this seemingly impossible mission genuinely stood a reasonable chance of technical success, whatever the enormous additional risks the mission would inevitably carry once the bombers were actually over hostile Japanese territory. The specific aircraft selected for the mission, the North American B-25 Mitchell, required extensive modification before it could realistically be considered suitable for the mission's unusual demands. Engineers stripped the aircraft of non-essential equipment to reduce weight and increase fuel capacity, including removing much of the aircraft's defensive armament and replacing certain gun positions with wooden dummy weapons intended to provide at least a visual deterrent against enemy fighter attack. Given that the genuine combat weight savings achieved by removing actual functional weaponry were considered more valuable than the modest additional defensive capability those weapons would have provided. Additional fuel tanks were installed throughout the aircraft, occupying space that would normally have been used for other equipment or crew comfort, reflecting the absolute priority placed on maximizing the aircraft's operational range, given the extraordinary distances the mission would require the bombers to fly. The aircrew selected to fly this mission, drawn from volunteers within an Army Air Forces bomber squadron, underwent intensive specialized training at a naval air station specifically to prepare them for the entirely unfamiliar challenge of taking off from an aircraft carrier's dramatically shorter runway distance compared to the conventional airfields these pilots had trained on throughout their military careers. This training period, conducted at Eglin Field in Florida over several intensive weeks, required pilots to master a fundamentally different takeoff technique than anything their prior conventional flight training had prepared them for, involving full engine power applied while holding the aircraft's brakes, followed by a specific, carefully timed release and control input sequence intended to allow the heavily loaded bomber to become airborne within a fraction of the runway distance these aircraft would normally require. Naval aviation instructors familiar with the general principles of carrier operations, though themselves unfamiliar with attempting anything like this specific maneuver with an aircraft as large and heavy as the modified B-25, worked closely with Doolittle's volunteer aircrews to refine this technique through repeated practice runs, gradually building both the technical proficiency and, just as importantly, the psychological confidence that would be required to execute this maneuver successfully under the added pressure and unfamiliarity of an actual carrier deck, likely amid rolling ocean swells and unpredictable wind conditions that a static airfield runway would never present. This training proved genuinely essential, since even experienced military pilots found the specific technique required for a heavily loaded B-25 to successfully become airborne within the limited distance available on a carrier's flight deck to be a fundamentally different and considerably more demanding challenge than anything their prior flight training had prepared them for. Critically, and in keeping with the extraordinary secrecy surrounding the entire operation, the majority of the aircrews who volunteered for this training did not know the specific nature or ultimate target of the mission they were preparing for until relatively late in the preparation process, understanding only that they were volunteering for an unusually dangerous mission requiring specialized carrier takeoff training, without initially being informed that their eventual target would be mainland Japan itself, a detail withheld both to maintain operational security and, quite possibly, to allow volunteers additional opportunity to reconsider their participation before being informed of the mission's full, genuinely extraordinary risk profile. In April 1942, the 16 modified B-25 bombers, along with their volunteer aircrews, were loaded aboard the aircraft carrier USS Hornet, which then departed for a rendezvous point in the Pacific Ocean, where it would join additional naval escort vessels before proceeding towards Japanese waters. The plan called for the task force to approach to within several hundred miles of the Japanese coast, close enough to bring Tokyo and other Japanese cities within the B-25's operational range, while still maintaining sufficient distance to reduce the risk of the carrier task force itself being detected and attacked by Japanese naval or air forces before the bombers could be launched. The mission encountered a serious, unexpected complication considerably earlier than planners had originally intended. On the morning of April 18, 1942, while the task force was still considerably farther from Japan than the planned launch point, American vessels were spotted by a Japanese picket boat, a small vessel positioned specifically to provide early warning of any approaching enemy forces. Although American naval escorts quickly engaged and sank this vessel, task force commanders recognized that the Japanese crew had almost certainly succeeded in radioing a warning back to Japanese military command before their vessel was destroyed, meaning that any element of surprise the mission had originally depended upon was now potentially compromised, with Japanese forces likely already alerted to the presence of an American carrier task force in the region. Faced with this development, mission commanders made the difficult decision to launch the bombers immediately, roughly 10 hours earlier and from considerably farther from the Japanese coast than the mission's original planning had called for, a decision that dramatically increased the already substantial risk that the bombers would run out of fuel before reaching safe landing territory, but that was considered necessary given the very real possibility that continued delay would result in Japanese forces intercepting and potentially destroying the American task force before any of the bombers could be launched at all. This early launch decision effectively eliminated any realistic possibility that the mission's aircrews could safely return to any American or Allied airfield following their bombing runs, transforming what had already been understood as an extraordinarily risky mission into one where the aircrews now understood with considerably greater certainty that they would very likely need to either crash land, bail out over hostile or unfamiliar territory, or attempt to reach whatever limited friendly territory might realistically be within their now extended flight range, primarily portions of China not yet under Japanese occupation, itself a genuinely uncertain and dangerous destination given the chaotic, rapidly shifting military situation across occupied China at this stage of the broader war. Despite this dramatically compressed timeline and the enormous additional risk it introduced, all 16 B-25 bombers successfully launched from the Hornet's flight deck, each pilot executing the specialized short-distance takeoff technique they had trained for in the preceding weeks, a technical achievement that, on its own, represented a genuinely unprecedented demonstration of both aircraft capability and pilot skill, given that none of these aircraft had ever been specifically designed for carrier operations of any kind. The bombers proceeded toward their assigned targets across Tokyo and several other Japanese cities, flying at extremely low altitude for much of the approach, specifically to avoid detection by Japanese radar and anti-aircraft defenses, a tactic that proved remarkably effective given how genuinely unprepared Japanese air defenses were for the possibility of an American bombing attack against the home islands at this stage of the war. Contemporary accounts from Japanese civilians who witnessed the raid firsthand describe a scene of genuine, widespread confusion rather than immediate panic, since many observers initially assumed the low-flying aircraft passing overhead were Japanese military planes conducting routine training exercises, an assumption that reflected just how completely the possibility of an actual American attack on the home islands had been dismissed by both military planners and the general public in the months following Japan's rapid, seemingly overwhelming string of military successes across the Pacific. Some Japanese anti-aircraft units reportedly did not even attempt to engage the American bombers as they passed, apparently sharing the same initial assumption that the aircraft overhead belonged to Japan's own military, rather than representing an actual hostile incursion. The psychological impact of this unpreparedness cannot be overstated, since Japanese military and civilian leadership had, as previously noted, consistently assured the domestic population that such an attack was essentially impossible, meaning that the actual appearance of American bombers over Tokyo and other Japanese cities produced genuine shock and confusion among both civilian populations and military defenders who had never seriously anticipated needing to prepare for this specific scenario. The bombing raids themselves inflicted relatively modest physical damage compared to the massive strategic bombing campaigns that would characterize later stages of the Pacific War, a reflection of both the deliberately limited bomb loads the mission's fuel constraints had necessitated and the fundamentally symbolic, psychological objectives that had always been the mission's primary purpose, rather than any realistic expectation of inflicting decisive material damage on Japanese military industrial capacity through the single, relatively small-scale raid. Nonetheless, the raid succeeded completely in its primary strategic objective, definitively demonstrating that the Japanese home islands were not, in fact, invulnerable to American attack, a psychological blow to Japanese confidence and a corresponding morale boost for American and Allied forces that arrived at a moment when positive news from the Pacific theater had been genuinely scarce. Following the completion of their bombing runs, the 16 air crews faced the genuinely perilous challenge of finding safe landing locations, given their now severely compromised fuel situation resulting from the mission's early, unplanned launch. 15 of the 16 aircraft ultimately either crash-landed or required their crews to bail out over portions of China, depending on whether the crew members landed in areas controlled by sympathetic Chinese forces or in territory under Japanese occupation. The 16th aircraft, facing an even more severe fuel shortage than its fellow bombers, made the decision to divert to Soviet territory rather than attempt the considerably longer flight toward China, landing near Vladivostok in Soviet-controlled territory. Although the Soviet Union and Japan maintained a formal neutrality agreement at this stage of the war that technically obligated Soviet authorities to intern rather than assist American military personnel who landed on Soviet soil, this particular cruise aircraft and crew members were held in a form of extended, relatively comfortable internment for over a year before eventually being allowed to make their way through a circuitous and carefully arranged route back to American-controlled territory, an outcome that avoided the more immediately dangerous fate that awaited several of their fellow air crews who came down within Japanese-controlled portions of China. The fate of the air crews who landed within areas of China still under some degree of local Chinese control, whether through the direct efforts of Chinese resistance forces, sympathetic local civilians, or, in some cases, considerable personal risk taken by ordinary Chinese villagers who provided shelter, food, and guidance to American airmen, despite the very real danger that Japanese forces would violently punish any Chinese civilians discovered assisting American military personnel. generally proved considerably more fortunate than those who came down within areas more directly under Japanese military control or influence. Many of these rescue efforts, once documented and later recounted by surviving American aircrew members, revealed an extraordinary degree of coordinated assistance from Chinese civilians and military forces alike, despite the considerable danger such assistance carried, and despite significant language barriers and the general chaos of operating within a country that was itself already engaged in years of brutal, ongoing warfare against Japanese occupation forces. Chinese guerrilla fighters and local civilian networks guided stranded American airmen across considerable distances, often through mountainous or otherwise difficult terrain, moving primarily under cover of darkness and relying on an extensive, informal network of sympathetic local contacts to avoid Japanese patrols actively searching the region for exactly this kind of downed American aircrew. Some American airmen later described being passed from one local guide to another across a chain of communities, each willing to accept the considerable personal risk of assisting them for at least a portion of their journey toward eventual safety, a testament to the depth of anti-Japanese sentiment and genuine goodwill toward American forces that existed within occupied and contested regions of wartime China during this period. The human cost borne by Chinese civilians in the aftermath of the raid would prove to be one of the most tragic and, for many years, insufficiently recognized consequences of the entire mission. Japanese military forces, in a brutal campaign of collective retaliation against the Chinese population believed to have assisted the American aircrews in evading capture, conducted an extended punitive military campaign across the regions of China where the surviving American airmen had come down. A campaign that historians estimate resulted in the deaths of a staggering number of Chinese civilians, with some estimates suggesting the total death toll from this retaliatory campaign may have reached into the hundreds of thousands, representing a genuinely devastating human cost that vastly exceeded any casualties inflicted by the raid itself, and that stands as a sobering reminder of the severe consequences that Japanese occupation forces were willing to inflict on civilian populations believed to have provided any assistance to Allied military personnel throughout the broader Pacific War. Of the 80 aircrew members who participated in the raid, the substantial majority ultimately survived and eventually made their way back to American-controlled territory, though several crew members were killed, either during the crash landings and bailout process itself, or, in a small number of tragic cases, were captured by Japanese forces and subsequently executed as a direct violation of international law governing the treatment of captured military personnel, a further indication of the severe risks the volunteer aircrews had understood themselves to be accepting from the very outset of the mission. Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle himself, who had personally piloted one of the 16 bombers and had bailed out over Chinese territory along with his own crew following the completion of his bombing run, initially believed in the immediate aftermath of the mission that the raid should likely be considered a military failure, given the relatively modest physical damage inflicted on Japanese targets and the loss of all 16 aircraft involved in the operation, none of which had been able to return to any friendly airfield in operational condition. Doolittle reportedly expected, upon his eventual return to the United States, that he would likely face a court-martial for what he anticipated senior military leadership would judge to be an unsuccessful and costly mission. This assessment proved dramatically and somewhat ironically mistaken. Rather than facing disciplinary consequences, Doolittle returned to a hero's welcome, was promoted 2 full ranks to Brigadier General, and was awarded the Medal of Honor in recognition of both his personal leadership of the mission and the raid's substantial, if primarily psychological and strategic rather than directly material, contribution to American and Allied morale during a genuinely difficult period of the broader Pacific War. The raid's strategic significance extended considerably beyond its immediate psychological impact on American and Japanese morale, contributing to a series of important, if somewhat indirect, consequences for the broader trajectory of the Pacific War. The decision by Japanese naval leadership to prioritize the ambitious Midway operation reflected a broader shift in Japanese strategic thinking that the Doolittle Raid helped accelerate. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the senior Japanese naval commander who had originally planned and overseen the Pearl Harbor attack, reportedly cited the psychological necessity of preventing any repeat of an attack against the Japanese home islands as a significant factor in his push for the Midway operation. Japanese military leadership, embarrassed and genuinely alarmed by the demonstrated vulnerability of the home islands to American attack, redirected additional military resources toward home island air defense that might otherwise have been deployed toward continued offensive operations elsewhere in the Pacific theater. Perhaps most significantly, the raid is generally credited by historians with contributing to the Japanese military's decision to prioritize an ambitious, ultimately catastrophic offensive operation aimed at capturing Midway Island, intended in part to eliminate the American aircraft carrier forces that Japanese commanders now recognized posed a genuine, ongoing threat to the Japanese home islands. This subsequent Battle of Midway, fought only weeks after the Doolittle Raid, would prove to be one of the most decisive American naval victories of the entire war, inflicting catastrophic, irreplaceable losses on Japanese carrier aviation forces that fundamentally altered the strategic balance of the Pacific War in America's favor for the remainder of the conflict.
Doolittle himself would go on to a distinguished remainder of his military career throughout the war, eventually commanding major American air forces during the European theater of operations, overseeing large-scale strategic bombing campaigns considerably larger in scale and material impact than the single symbolically significant raid that had first brought him widespread public recognition. Yet it was the Tokyo Raid, undertaken at one of the darkest moments of the entire war for American forces, that would remain the defining achievement most closely associated with his name for the remainder of his long life, a reflection of just how significant the mission's psychological and strategic impact genuinely proved to be, despite Doolittle's own initial, considerably more modest assessment of what his volunteer crews had actually accomplished. In the years since the war's end, the Doolittle Raid has come to be remembered as one of the most audacious and consequential American military operations of the entire Second World War. A mission whose participants volunteered for a task that offered, by any conventional military calculation, essentially no realistic prospect of a safe return. Undertaken at a moment when American military fortunes in the Pacific stood at their lowest ebb, and that ultimately succeeded in achieving strategic and psychological objectives that would prove considerably more consequential than the mission's modest immediate physical damage might otherwise have suggested. Surviving members of the raid's aircrews continued to hold periodic reunions in the decades following the war, a tradition that continued until the deaths of the mission's final surviving participants, honoring a mission whose success ultimately depended not on the physical damage its bombers managed to inflict, but on the sheer willingness of 80 American volunteers to accept a mission they understood from the very outset might well cost them their lives.
These reunions, held annually for decades and involving an increasingly small number of surviving participants as the years passed, included a distinctive private tradition among the surviving raiders themselves, involving a set of engraved silver goblets, one for each of the 80 original aircrew members, that were used in a private toast ceremony at each gathering, with the goblet of any raider who had died since the previous reunion ceremonially turned upside down, a quietly moving tradition that continued for over 7 decades until the deaths of the mission's final surviving participants in the years following 2013, at which point the last surviving raiders held a final, formal toast, bringing this long tradition to its natural conclusion. This has been Forgotten Frontlines. Every story we bring you is researched, written, and brought to life by the V-Team, because some battles deserve to be remembered, no matter how strange, no matter how forgotten. If this story moved you, like this video, share it with someone who loves history, and subscribe for more forgotten stories from the front lines of the past. We'll see you in the next one.